And you can hand the host back and I can shut it off if that's your desire.
Will do.
All righty. Hey there, hi there, ho there. The end of the month, weekly marks on a Saturday. Volume two of Capital is what we've been looking at. We're going to continue to look at it for probably the next couple of months, and it may just take that long to read. I pointed out before that some other folks have reading projects where you sort of can plow through the reading. Well, it shouldn't be seen like that. I think it's the kind of thing where you can put it aside, come back, and sort of figure out kind of the stuff that's going on with it. So for me, it's plugging in various areas that I spent a little time on, but realized when I was in school that no one was interested in this stuff. So and it wasn't because it was necessarily politically verboten. It was just that there were very few people trained in it, at least on this side of the globe. So I came across a thing that I've returned back to, and it, of course, triggered other memories. Vasily Leontiev, Nobel Prize in economics, probably I don't know if you want to call him the father of input-output analysis, but I came across several interlocking articles on issues related to input-output analysis. And of course, some side issues about whether talking about input-output analysis was actually communistic. And in fact, there's a small literature that discusses whether Leontiev himself ever commented on socialist stuff, because he was, raised in the Soviet Union, did emigrate to the United States, and surprise, surprise, it's a small world. His daughter wrote an article that I found important and useful. Really good article too on mannerist art, but nevertheless, she was an art historian. He's an economist, and input-output analysis is that kind of thing that could be identified, can be identified. There's a history for it, and it's a kind of the intersection of accounting data and the physiocrat sort of stuff, the tableau économique. It's a variety of things. It's an intersection of stuff. I've joked before that if only we could have given Marx an Excel spreadsheet, might have been totally better off. But input-output analysis is not really taught in the U.S. context, although I think it may be applied in some places where people do linear programming or industrial process analysis or stuff. And of course, since it's just probably the best way to teach people certain types of stuff, including math. But anyway, I'm bringing it up because I came across an article that integrates some of these areas together, which is sort of the stuff I'm working on anyway that I'm fiddling around with. So without further ado, this has several different components in it. Includes certain historical details, a certain controversy, and then I'll read from the primary article, which it has a very useful discussion that I think you'll find hopefully useful. All of this relates to Circuits of Capital, Volume 2 of Capital, and I hope you'll see how it connects. Needless to say, the first thing that we have to think about or look at is, particularly since we have these continuing features that are not a bug, but a feature of capitalism, an inexorable collapse. It's this growth or die sort of stuff. In the capitalist context, it's important to actually build on things like bankruptcy. There are only a couple of folks whose own research is on the issue, and not even from a Marxian point of view, of the concept of bankruptcy. It's a really interesting kind of problem, and not enough time or energy is spent on it. But and the question is, of course, how connected is it to the tendency for the rate of profit to fall? Questions of underconsumption or overproduction, questions of unemployment, the reserve army of the unemployed, reserve army of labor. And so this cycle, competition for workers, threat of higher wages, labor displacing machinery, depression, these are all of a piece, as we've seen in Capital. And Marx has suggested that this is a feature, not a bug, part of an entire mode of production that will eventually, if you're a historical materialist, lead to capitalism's either revolutionary or evolutionary downfall and transformation to at least some intermediate phase that we might call socialism, and then ultimately to something that has no classes, no money, perhaps, and a variety of other things called communism. Now, this communism resembles the early communism, that is the pre-modern or prehistoric a kind of communism of the primitive communism. All of these things, as a matter of history, are about realization, knowledge building, empowerment, development, all those nice ideas. I do return here to David Harvey's diagram, which is fairly complete and is worth you're looking at, because at the end, it ultimately includes everything. It's global. It has, the production, reproduction, destruction of human nature and culture, which is kind of what's going to happen in that particular context. It has free gifts of human nature, which is everything that's outside us, everything that is not the Anthropocene, and includes wants, needs, desires, questions of demand, demand's relationship to need or necessity. That's all kind of wound up in there, and then the kind of things that we've built up as in terms of human history, the state, etc. Also the role of money, the role of commodities in the Marxian sense of that it's all built around the idea of a commodity, something that becomes important because it is exchange, because it is a way in which we engage with the world and engage with other people. That commodities are not just physical; they can be, actions or activities. They are collectivities of a sort, that resemble in some ways families, good and bad. So they have all those elements to it. And so an economy, not unlike the idea that the basic economy is a, as it were, home economy, where we get the word from, is that we build up at scale certain kinds of ideas. And it is at scale that we see kind of the bigger problems of it and the relationship of certain abstract forms like labor. So I just point that out. This last week, I've been talking a little bit about Bourdieu and the notion of cultural capital as a means of extending certain concepts about capital analysis applied to more cultural objects, which is one of the underlying issues for early Marx, the humanist Marx, as it were. The French analysis of people like Bourdieu are to talk about what are cultural institutions like? How do we build cultural capital? So you can see here that once you begin to start applying it, this is a kind of post-war French sort of deal, but you can see in the upper left, dominant class, conditions of existence, a dominant primary habitus. Remember, I discussed the idea that the habitus sort of talks about a whole kind of system of existence that kind of establishes how we think about culture and integrates culture. And then the coding of it as cultural capital, its evolution as a selectivity of various sort of advanced knowledge building from school. And in the lower left, you can see the dominated class, its conditions of existence as a dominated primary habitus, which is not necessarily identical to the dominant class's habitus, although their intersection is the big issue for the French. And the French build this into the difference between, you know, country and city, etc. Note, of course, it is a deselected cultural capital as opposed to a privileged cultural capital. And that's kind of a very French, but also a very useful analysis, because you can see that, like the recent Olympics, you know, you can see kind of high culture built into it, but also very basic culture built into it. And I actually liked the Paris Olympics because it did try to build those two things. In its own cultural presentation, it actually does a whole materialist history thing. If you watch the closing ceremonies in the Olympics, it's really quite amusing. You know, sort of a little, you know, up from nothings kind of you know, the cultural clay, as they say. Anyway, note that in the final, on the right-hand side of this diagram, there's consecration, legitimation, or legitimization, if you want to use that word. The idea is that the choices from the institution, that is school, it's the development of its capital has directions, success or failure. And so stigmatization is part of that as well. You have things that are privileged or celebrated and other things that are marginalized. So that's what Bourdieu is talking about, the kind of way in which hierarchies are built, the cultural hierarchy. And it's a useful adjunct to the basic sort of cultural, the basic production analysis, so that you can see that culture is produced as well. There is cultural work, there's cultural production, and that's important. I also came across a CIA article that was sort of a basic little history of why the CIA economics analysis of the Soviet Union, because that was really important. You know, having that knowledge, knowing whether your enemies, that is, speaking of the Cold War, knowing your enemy's capabilities is really darned important. And looking at economic stuff like that is actually quite important. Peer from college, whose parents worked for a adjunct to the Intel agencies, talked a lot about how there was that kind of economic, when during the Vietnam War, they were actually working on not so much the ability of the Vietnamese to wage war, but the things that operated in the informal economy, such as the drug trade, which was actually a bigger economic force within the context of running a war. So that's kind of what, you know, intel agencies work on. So that's a Herblock cartoon talking about the estimates on Soviet economics. So the reason why I came across this, of course, is to think about Vasily Leontiev. And needless to say, Leontiev, when he comes to the U.S. during the Second World War, works on these kinds of things for a variety of emigres, worked for the U.S. government. Many famous economists worked for many different government institutions. And so Leontiev works for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but he was also at Harvard, much like many other folks, as we know. And it's important to distinguish between the kind of applied version of input-output analysis. Um, you can imagine it simply as a kind of grid, a matrix, a spreadsheet. You relate one thing to another, and in the in this sort of set of matrices, and in an input-output analysis, it accounts for an entire economy. You can literally do the entire economy that way. And so you could see that, and particularly its history reveals itself, that some people in the Communist Party tried to engage with this kind of set of ideas. And, it is problematic, of course, because you could see that some people, Bukharin, would take one side of this sort of example, and other people, this is sort of the so-called left opposition and right opposition during Stalinism. And, it just may seem like there's just one evil, but a lot of folks were contending, and unfortunately one side wins, and a bunch of folks, Soviet economists, actually lost their lives during some of these political purges because, they were just simply taking not a political position so much as a theoretical position. So statistical side of input-output analysis is it represents inter-industry flows of inputs and outputs between industries, and they're expressed generally in monetary units, not necessarily objects themselves, but currency flows. According to Leontiev, the input-output table is close to Quenet's tableau économique. The table permits the calculation of the quantitative requirement of a commodity, I, to produce one unit of the commodity, J, noted. This ratio is called a technical coefficient. Now, if you do this kind of work long enough, you'll realize that a system of coefficients, call them technical, whatever, allow you to evaluate or sum an entire surface of interactions, an entire set of a grid, a cube of all of these interrelated elements of an economy. And if you're thinking about centralized planning under the Soviet model, it certainly would be good to have a computational model that could actually do all these things. And yes, that's what the Soviets were working on this. The Americans were working on this. The whole issue of cybernetics of the early post-war period is exactly the same kind of thing. Because both sides, all sides, were working on, how do we do a war? And so centralized production allows a lot of accounting data that firms are not competing. Rather, the data is pretty much, transparent and much more fluid anyway. And so that you can sort of look at production, because what are you producing it for? Well, the goal is to produce more munitions and stuff to defeat the enemy. And therefore, there's not a lot of asymmetry in information. Yes, there is, of course. And then there's always the decision-making process, which affects, procurement and a variety. And then, of course, there's corruption. So all of these things are still apply, but doesn't mean to say that you can't have a Walrasian model. Leon Walras is one of the guys who gives us this is going to sound too complicated, but there's this basic idea of general equilibrium theory, which you see in most basic textbooks. It's still there. The problem is that it's been sort of messed around with so much that it should not really be taught. Or one could argue anyway that it should not be taught in terms of, if you're going to teach economics. And I included in today's reading a little video with Steve Keen suggesting that, well, maybe we shouldn't do economics at all. No one should be doing economics. Keen is coming from the point of view that since all of the models are kind of bogus and the math is problematic, that it's probably better to study something else and then come to economics to worry about the economic issues, not so much from economics, but perhaps from someplace else like computer science or math. But anyway, doesn't reduce everything to computer science and math. It's just simply that the tools are good enough now so that we don't have to be teaching these sort of discipline-specific models. And if you've been in school too long, you begin to realize that sometimes these models are, it's fine to to introduce material, but it may be that the basic material that you're introducing has some problematic premises. Anyway, Leontiev called this particular model an input-output model, a simplified Gaussian model, as a technical coefficients, and most of the equations of the model are almost formally similar to Walras's equations in his Element d'économie politique pure. So the elements of pure political economics. One of the major inventions of Leontiev was to translate Walras's equations into matrix algebra. Now, matrix algebra, obviously, if you could see it in the solutions and stuff, you can see that all these things, row column logic and stuff, that's all kind of cool. A table, actually, table logic kind of works. So you put them all together. And the fact is, it combines a variety of things, vectors and identities and, reductions of stuff and lots of letters and stuff. Don't worry, I'm not going to lose you in the, there's not much math today. The combination of the input-output table and the model of Leontiev is the clue of the success of input-output analysis, IOA, after World War II, first in the United States and then worldwide. According to Leontiev, this project was imagined during his research stay in Kiel. That's where he got his degree, the University of Kiel, and theoretically ready soon in the 30s. Indeed, in Kiel, Leontiev worked on econometric estimations of Marshallian demanded supply functions. That may sound a little opaque to you, but Marshallian analysis is sort of the dominant form of neoclassical economics, and does apply it's a sort of a tight model, one not familiar to Marx, unfortunately. This work seemingly conducted him to admit the theoretical superiority of the general equilibrium approach to partial equilibrium analysis. Partial equilibrium analysis allows you to do, certain other components of these things that you've got in kind of matrix form. As a consequence, Leontiev built a operational version of general equilibrium theory that was later called input-output analysis. The question that arises is to know whether the Walrasian reference is a way not to speak, this is the underlying story here, of the Soviet and Marxian classical influence on the table and the model of Leontiev, because he denies any socialist connections to his research. But the reality is, of course, it's all there. And, but as I've said before, in reference to other folks, Marvin Minsky, for example, or Hyman Minsky, I'm sorry, that we have, the issue of being very disciplined and not mentioning communist stuff, especially if you're in the United States. Indeed, the previous story is coherent, but Leontiev always played down or held back the Soviet influence on his own work. Leontiev gave many interviews where he always claimed that Soviet economists didn't inspire his work. My readings were not influenced by the revolution. My scientific works were not influenced very much by the current state of political affairs, noted Leontiev. However, you remember that during his frequent imprisonments, he was thrown in prison a bunch. That's kind of comes with the territory if you're, you're smart at all. You could have long discussions about Hegel, Marx, and the Russian philosophy. More surprising is Leontiev's answer to Duncan Foley. Duncan Foley is a Marxist economist at the New School and Columbia. Foley asked, was anyone at that time thinking about a statistical basis for planning in the Soviet Union? And Leontiev said no. The first thing which had some relation to it was essentially a national income analysis. Like all national income analyses, it was not very disaggregated. Everything gives you one figure. Well, I thought that to understand the operation of the system, one figure is not enough. In other words, you need to sort of look at kind of this whole range of activity. Finally, when Foley asked him about Marx's influence, Leontiev answered, no, not really. No, Marx is not a very good mathematician. This is a way of sidestepping the question. He was always mixed up in math, and the labor theory of value didn't make much sense. And all that is likely true. These are three purely negative statements about the influence of statistical and theoretical Soviet works and Marxian classical theory on the making of input-output analysis. It's easily understandable that in the 1930s, it was certainly easier to get funds from the Harvard scientific community. I think that's probably what it really was written as, for an empirical work on general equilibrium structural relations than for a statistical Soviet project. For instance, after World War II, many attacks in journals denounced the use of federal money to construct a quote-unquote communist technology. In the US, input-output analysis was clearly suspicious. It was denounced as a social technology adapted to planning economies, but irrelevant for a free market economy. Well, if you've looked at a little bit about the history of cybernetics and other systems philosophy and stuff in the American context, really no damn difference. Leontiev lost his governmental financial supports from public administration and from the U.S. Army, first just after the war, 1945 to 47, and later during McCarthyism. Having a Russian name is probably also suspicious. And between 54 and 59, the high period, and also the period of the, Khrushchev's speech on, and the sort of, you could call it revisionist, I suppose, anti-Stalinist crusades or campaigns. Paradoxically, Leontiev found constant supports from private firms like the Westinghouse Corporation. Maybe as a consequence of these political tensions, Leontiev didn't participate in the socialist calculation debate, while general equilibrium theorists like Chalin Koopmans and Oscar Lange did. Even though evidences of Leontiev's interest in socialist calculation were found in his archives, he never discussed openly the theory of socialism. However, the interviews previously quoted, they're from the 80s and 90s. And this is after he gets the Nobel Prize, and he'd left Harvard for NYU. To conclude, one must admit that Leontiev's personal strategy, that is psychological and academic strategy, was to not deny any Soviet influence on his work. So according to him, there's nothing to be found about the origins of input-output analysis in the Soviet economics of the 1920s, when Leontiev was in the USSR. According to him, that was the failure of Marshallian analysis to represent the economic system that led him to the empirical application of general equilibrium. To do it, Duncan Foley, he said, I would interpret input-output analysis as an outgrowth of neoclassical theory. Well, you can argue that. That's fine. The reality is, I think, somewhat different. So I know that sounds fairly complicated, but these are the core, the foundational elements. And fiddling around with this, I also discovered that there's a mistranslation. This is the usual kind of thing that academics love doing. And that is that the basic concept of a free, perfect, pure competition market may be a misnomer relative to a translation from French. That is, Walras' idea of the way in which you have negotiation or activity relative to an equilibrium is seen as an auction. It's described as an auction. Well, the reality is that there was a mistranslation of Walras, and that he uses the word crier, which is criers, as in town criers, which is, there must be some literature on this. This is actually kind of amusing. And so these two guys, Walker and Van Dahl, sort of discover this. And this is Walker and Van Dahl, and 2014. I mean, Jesus, we've gone almost a century of misinterpretation. Call this a momentous error that has misled generations of readers into thinking that the markets in Walras' model are auction markets, and that he assigned the function of changing prices in his model to an auctioneer, which it truly does change the way in which you think about it. That is, if you have an auctioneer and you have bidding and a variety of other things, whereas if you think of it simply as a town crier, it's a different kind of market. In other words, the auctioneer guides the process as opposed to the town crier who simply announces information. Anyway, the core article for today's little yammering is this article by Ezra Davar, who is, I think, an Israeli, and I don't think he has an academic location, but he must, but I can't seem to find when he works more independently. Marx and Input-Output Analysis in General Equilibrium Theory is a little article published in 2016. And more interestingly, of course, is the Pluto Press actually has a kind of journal division, and this journal division it has been picked up by JSTOR, which provides, in this particular case, a free article, which is very cool, and one that ultimately in the big archaeological history of these things will, I think, be really important. Anyway, here's the abstract for it. This article shows the following. Number one, Marx has been given a description of the relationship between industries, which is equivalent to Valra's theoretical version of input-output and to Leontiev's empirical monetary input-output analysis. So there's note that Valra's talking about input-output, Leontiev's talking about input-output, and then you have Marx is talking about inter-industry relations, which is what he talks about in volume 2 of Capital. Circuits of capital. These are the Department 1, Department 2 relations, but you see it sort of writ large in an economy. Now, Marx in Capital is doing this very simply and with basic arithmetic and trying to show that the thing sort of works, and you can see how kind of it moves along. And it's kind of very basic in that sense. And of course, Leontiev would obviously, critique the math of it. On the other hand, Marx is a bit of a gadfly about the mathematical relations, but needless to say, I think had he, had fewer carbuncles or whatever, probably things would have been different. Anyway, number two, Marx's version of general equilibrium theory is characterized by the attributes required for the formulation of the theoretical abstract model. That is, the conditions for the existence of the general equilibrium state and simplified assumptions. His theory is characterized by different rates of profit, unemployment of primary factors with positive prices, old commodities, and so on. Also, Marx's money theory, as well as Adam Smith's and Valra's, is relevant to modern society. Moreover, Marx, as well as Valra, stated repeatedly that in reality, equilibrium is never achieved. See, the ideal version of this, as I was suggesting with the difference between auctioneers and criers, is that the suggestion is, in a Marshallian way, that you could get to a perfect distribution of stuff. The market would clear, whatever. All these things work out, but they don't. They never do. But, it's interesting because it's always taught that way, the perfect competition sort of model. Moreover, Marx, as well as Valra, stated repeatedly that in reality, equilibrium is never achieved, but he asserted that the study of equilibrium achievement is necessary for managing real economics by revealing the nature of distortions of equilibrium states and treating them. This is actually the most important point relative to people looking at, as some authors have brought back the analysis of, looking at sort of retconning, as it were, the analytic Marxism. Analytic Marxism, some forms of it discuss this exact problem of the general equilibrium theory, and sort of showing that, it's taught in the neoclassical context as being, perfectible. And in the other case, or in other cases, in a heterodox way, you can see that it has all these problems that you sort of have to move beyond and go to some other kind of model. And that's the kind of post-Keynesian place that we find many of ourselves in. But this particular article shows that Marx, number one, Marx has been given a description of the relationship between industries, that is input-output. And number two, Marx's approach is characterized by the crucial attributes of general equilibrium theory, despite the fact that Marx's contribution to general equilibrium theory and input-output analysis is usually evaluated by the reproduction schemes, that is simple reproduction and extended reproduction, which were described by him in the second volume of Capital. See, there's a whole point to this because we're still in second volume of Capital, and you can sort of see that there's some relation here, but it's not fully articulated. I mean, not in Marx himself. He gives you a kind of grid-like framework and a multiple kind of, period thing that and inter-industry relations and stuff like that. It's just not all, plugged in as well as I think Marx would have done better to sort of reproduce in a better way the Kane model. But anyway, such is history. Such an evaluation is common to scholars of both East and West. At the time this becomes important to people, we're sort of in the middle of the Cambridge Capital controversy. So that's another thing that's going on in the background. They emphasize that Marx has confined himself to two sectors, that is, consumption and capital commodities. And he did not discuss an inter-industries model as in traditional input-output analysis. So already, this is not quite identical. In their works, they attempted to establish a connection between the reproduction schemes and standard input-output analysis and reformulate the first in terms of the latter. This article shows, however, that Marx has given a description of the relationship between industries, which is equivalent to Walras' theoretical version of input-output, and to Leontiev's empirical, that is the monetary version of the input-output analysis. Unfortunately, in this case, Marx did not discuss many industries, but Marx has drawn a picture which is almost identical to input-output in monetary terms. And furthermore, Marx's language in no way differs from it. So Marx's discussion of cycles and overlaps and interrelations, this all kind of fits. You could actually, transport it into a more input-output analysis sort of thing. Yet, despite the fact that Marx did not formulate a complete model of the whole economy and did not discuss the process of adjustment, that is, equilibrium establishment between individuals' economy and the whole economy, this article shows that generally, Marx's approach is characterized by the critical attributes of general equilibrium theory, so that it is equivalent to Walras' approach. Now, before let me make an aside here, and I think it's John Romer's work is instructive in this case because he's one of the few people who actually plows ahead and has written several, well, they're interesting if you're really into it. The theory of general equilibrium. This entire argument here was worked out during the heyday, the height, the acme of analytic Marxism. Needless to say, a lot of people don't follow it because of certain other ideological components that I don't know. I think Romer, Romer's still right, and even his more recent work addresses a sub-question, which is still the important one, which we've been talking about before. That is the role of law. In Romer's case, is a certain Kantian logic sort of at work relative to, well, anyway, how is it that we distribute justice? It's one of his sort of a fundamental sort of question. Anyway, back to the article. Article consists of 4 sections following the introduction. In the second section, Marx's version of input-output is considered. The third section considers the attributes of Marx's general equilibrium theory. And finally, conclusions are presented. Now, I'm not going to get onto the whole finitude of this since I'm going to be past my time soon, but let me give you the outline of it. It is, it has Kane of the Tableau Économique, which tries to include a whole variety of agricultural and other sectors, production sectors. And it is a way of trying to quantify, to make analytic, no different than other Enlightenment kind of pursuits during the period, to try and sort of provide better detail about a national economy, knowing full well, of course, that it's GIGO, that is garbage in, garbage out, and that there are other factors that would screw up the ability to do a tableau, an actual state-sponsored tableau économique. But anyway, that's another story. So it is this question of schemes for reproduction. That is the notion that this is all a kind of circulatory process that is, everyone needs to sustain themselves, to reproduce themselves. And this is sort of, you need to sort of define all the elements that would provide for at least a basic sense of how the thing moves forward. It should be emphasized that Marx confined himself to two sectors, that is, consumption and capital commodities, and did not discuss an inter-industries model as in traditional input-output analysis. This article shows, however, that Marx has given a description of the relationship between industries and sort of has those equivalents. Unfortunately, he's drawn a picture that's identical to input output in monetary terms, but his language really in no way differs from it. But at the same time, it's necessary to note some points. So first of all, Marx presented his model as a numerical example, and in this case, in order to discuss the essence of the idea, a few industries are kind of enough. Secondly, there are several passages of explanation in the text where Marx indicated that his numerical example might be extended without limitation in order to describe the real economy closely. So in other words, Marx is presenting a kind of theoretical model with a limited set of terms. Finally, Marx could not discuss the inter-industrial case for a larger number of industries because in his time, the required tools, the theory of matrix, computer technology, etc., did not exist. Needless to say, we can write interesting science fiction stories and counterfactuals. Though Marx's assumptions for input-output, they're crucial assumptions that are very Marx. The Marx version of this has certain underlying premises. Okay, common assumptions are, number one, each commodity is produced only by one industry. Note that this is the same way that Sraffa goes on to talk about Ricardo, et cetera, et cetera. Each industry produces only one commodity. Total output equals, that is sales, equals total input, purchases for each industry separately. So you're really restricting the set of interactions and arguments, because otherwise it will make you nuts. Total value added, that is the value of all services or factors employed in all industries, equals total value of final uses, that is the value of all commodities consumed by all categories of final uses. It's a very simple model, a micro foundational or appearing model. And Marx understood the importance of this last assumption, that is total value added, and equaling total value of final uses, which is also known as a budget constraint law that in a different discourse, and emphasized it repeatedly. That is, this is Marx. The total of labor newly added in a year, for example, is equal to the total of profit and wages. That is, it's equal to the total of the annual revenues spent on products which enter into individual consumption, food, clothing, heating, house stuff, furniture, etc. At the same time, Marx assumed additional simplifications would do not prevent the equivalency between both versions of input-output analysis, that is, Volra, and the Viantia of IOA. Marx, as well as Volra, differentiated between the industries of individual and production consumptions. We further assumed this is Marx, we further assumed in order to eliminate any recourse to quibbles and intermediate transactions that the linen was of a kind destined only for individual consumption and therefore could not serve in turn as raw material for some product. This is, Marx is thinking about this because he wants the model to work out sort of, and note that this is not about the production of linen or the comparison to iron. Rather, it is the whole issue of trying to create a model that works, that the abstraction works with. And I hope people have at least appreciated that in our readings of Capital. In addition, the number of categories of final uses was reduced by Marx to one, that is, individual consumptions, makes it a micro model. while the traditional tables of input output observed other categories. There's all kinds of other things. And so he's only reducing this down to an individual thing, because ultimately, if you're going to sell this idea, particularly to labor unions, et cetera, I think you're going to want to talk about, these are kitchen table items or whatever, from a political point of view, or a rhetorical point of view. But in general, until the present day, in the process of practical use of input output, the categories are aggregated as one. So this assumption is also relevant. The same is true for the aspect of value added. Here too, Marx reduced the number of services, that is the number of factors of services, to as a factor of one. Marx used three measures equally in the process: the yard, that is the measure of the commodity, which is used only for individual consumption. This is, in case of linen. Hour, the measure of labor, and shilling, the measure of money. So, three variables. In spite of this, he did not have any difficulty, since the relationship between them was defined by him in advance as 1 yard equals 3 shillings equals 3 hours of labor. If you read enough of this, you can see that he tries to standardize the argument. So, this works out. Now, the problem, of course, is that prices of things in this particular model are not, there's a lot of ink spilled on prices and value, but he doesn't sort of cop to it, at least at this point in the analysis. It's clear that it was on his mind, but and you can see this in other pamphlets, for example. So this is not, he didn't ignore it. It's just simply he's trying to get the model to sort of work with fairly simple terms. Here, as throughout this inquiry, it is, of course, always assumed that the commodity is sold and sold at its value. That's a whole nother discourse, and we won't go into that now. It must be noted that the same situation holds for the traditional input-output in monetary terms, where latent prices are used. This means, therefore, that the monetary term input-output, IO, is equivalent to Marx's version of IO. So, there's a lot of simplification here to get this little argument that there's an overlap between Leontief input-output analysis, Walras' concept of input-output, and Marx. This sounds like, over-triangulating, but the fact is there is a family resemblance among these terms. And you can, we could get really into the weeds on this, and we won't. There's a lot of numbers, but the fractions are very simple, and I hope I advise you sort of look at it just to assure yourself that the math sort of works out even at this very simple level. And the issue here in this next section is on issues of constant and variable capital, and working out whether there's a balance between input and output for the industries. And so the author gives us a kind of a tabular version that we could actually plug into a spreadsheet if we really wanted to, and see. And I think that you can see that, when you put it in matrix form, you can be, or tabular form. And then if you think of it as a matrix, you can actually work out lots of other things about the total of the economy once you start building equations and stuff into it. The point being is that you can get a number, actual number for value added, and a sense of input. And then you can begin to think, at least provide the basis for, which is problematic, of course. And, Leontief says, well, you can't think about labor in this context, but yes, you can. There's ways that you can do it. Therefore, in spite of the many simplifications on the basis of the above discussion, we can confidently assert that Marx created the first version of a prototype of modern input-output in monetary terms, while Walras created the theoretical version of input-output. This is worth fighting about, but it really doesn't matter. The point for me, anyway, is that you have a structural similarity among these things, and it's useful. It's useful because we can actually start making certain judgments about things that might apply. That is, we can test the historical results for certain things. Hopefully not too many of them, because it could get really ugly. But we can also use it as a way of arguing for a multimodal kind of approach to things. that we can draw in from a variety of fields to get this thing to work. Now, despite the fact that Marx did not formulate a complete model of the whole economy, did not discuss the process of adjustment, that is, equilibrium stuff between the individual's economy and the whole economy, still, in general, Marx's approach is equivalent, whatever that means, to Walras's. So this goes on, and as above. The issue is, of course, that it can identify that certain elements that are useful to us in a kind of heterodox approach to economics, and looking at certain issues that are brought up by other post-Keynesian sort of stuff, that all kind of still fits and forth, worth studying. And as I said, there's only one real sort of equation-like thing, and that's what it is. The point is that there's a kind of consonant among Volume 2, Leontief, Walras, and that describing this whole model as a system of circuits of capital is actually a still viable model, and it can work actually fairly well. There is some sub-differentiation between considering the theoretical model and how this can be applied, and there's a bit of a kind of working out of issues about how is it that we calculate averages and profits and stuff. But it comes down to some of the basic issues, and doesn't go too far off into the weeds. It supports some of the basic things that are necessary for a Marxian approach, that is, calculating the average rate of profit in a sector, because you need it to make this larger argument about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the transformation problem and a bunch of other things. And essentially what Marx is trying to do for his bigger project here is to say, well, in the critique of the classics is that they didn't spend enough time worrying about it, and that it's going to fall apart at some moment, and he's not making stuff up, and there's a certain way of thinking about it. So it is aside from the fact that he needs to get all these averages sort of worked out and to sort of provide the rationale for the proof of an empirical solution, the assumptions of things like rates of profit or whatever are still viable. There's plenty of proofs for it in the Cambridge capital controversy. There's support for it at a fairly high mathematical level, and it's not that dissonant from as a classical model. And this is part of the argument of saying that Marx is as classical as the classical economists and should not be sort of shunted off to the side or marginalized as not being relevant in the history of economic thought to Smith and Ricardo, et cetera. So, and the linchpin for this, of course, is monetary theory, and that's the other thing that's going on in here. Recall that we've discussed Marxist money theory as being, incomplete in the Marx case, but is being filled in, particularly the role of the state, in the application in the current situation in the 21st century of modern money theory, modern monetary theory. So this all gets fixed. Well, not completely fixed, but at least you get, some of the elements are nearly in place. And I think that you could see, if you're developing a research program, a way in which you can develop a kind of input-output analysis, a way of sort of mathematically sort of tying all these things together. So with the MMT folks sort of filling in this other thing, and then we've got these other kinds of issues relative to valorization and trade and blah, 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 blah. You can, there's a way in which Marx can be included or seen as not excludable from the current discourse. And it does have to do with how we define money. Money is a medium of exchange, measure of value, store of value, and there are the issue that the author here comes to is the question of price and equivalence. And so there's a bunch of things and the development of a concept of world money, et cetera. And the differences are there's some functional differences and the issue that Marx was faced with, because as we have looked at before as we did yesterday, in terms of Hilferding, he didn't have a fully developed model for finance capital. So, some of his theories about money are kind of simplified. That is, a gold economy is sort of, is there, and not this whole other system of representations about value. But anyway, aside from that, some of the conclusions are still worthwhile, and I think and there's a lot of quoting of Marx, Volume 2 in here. Let me get to the conclusion. So the article shows the following. We're supporting this idea that both Marx and Walras asserts that the state's intervention is required. In the end, like MMT and a variety of other things, you still need a state to sort of get some of this to work out. Sad for the libertarians. Marx has given a description of the relationship between industries, which is equivalent to Walras's theoretical version of input-output and to Leontiev's empirical, that is, his monetary version of input-output analysis. Marx's version of general equilibrium is characterized by the attributes required for the formulation of the theoretical, that is, abstract model, the conditions for the existence of the general equilibrium state, and simplified assumptions. His theory is characterized by different rates of profit, unemployment of factors with positive prices, unsold commodities, and so on. That is, unsold commodities are the question of overproduction or underconsumption, and that's an arguable point as well. Moreover, Marx's money theory, as well as Adam Smith's and Walras, is irrelevant to modern society. From this, it's clear that the non-classical concept of free goods with Walras's law. Remember, we were talking about auctioneers, right? This idea of perfect markets or whatever, based on a misinterpretation, as we've pointed out, which has played a significant role in modern mathematical economics, is one of the crucial components used when proving the existence of equilibrium. One of the main achievements of the modern general equilibrium theory is incompatible with Marx's theory, as well as with Smith and Walras's theory. So this is problematic, but the point of it is that, in reality, equilibrium is never achieved, and that the study of equilibrium achievement is necessary for managing real economics or real economies by revealing the nature of distortion of an equilibrium state and treating them. So, maybe a lot of hand waving, but I like it because it's sort of a good example of a kind of history of ideas approach, one that tries to show without a lot of math, how you can pick certain equilibrium ideas and not totally, there's a whole non-Walrasian thing that needs to be applied to this as well. And you can apply Smith and you can apply Marx, and you can sort of, and Leontiev gives us a kind of tool to show that this has all been consistent. There's a structural modeling and the methodology has always been there, and people have used it, and it sort of works. What is important is to, not only refine the theoretical apparatus, but always maintain contact with the applied version of it to show that its praxis, as it were, is still viable. So that's I got to the end of my yammering, and so I don't know who's left or whether there were any crazy comments or brickbats or whatever. Larry had a few interesting comments, and thank you, Larry. Yes, it does. It sounds like social capital. It has certain features that could be done in social capital. The problem, of course, is specifying or it's an identification. Everything in social science is an identification problem. It's always trying to figure out what things actually represent. Let's see. Yes, Walrasian. Walras, I assume is the Léon Walras. Anyway, so that's if there aren't any comments, I assume that I have host control. Yes, I do. And so I will immediately shut this off so we can swear again.
Thank you. This is great getting, the sort of